So as we continue on the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to get into a topic that goes all the way back to the very beginning of Scripture in Genesis, God's design for marriage. And where this goes back, it starts out very good. In fact, when you read the account, it's very interesting because I read Genesis 1 and 2 as complementary to each other, where Genesis 2 gives us greater detail into the events of day 6 of Genesis 1. There's literary features in the text that would guide us to read it that way, which if we put it together then, we have 6 times where God declares that the world is good. Then he creates the man, and for the first time, pulling in Genesis 2:18, something is not good. It's not good for the man to be alone. So there's this very good design to creation, because after the woman is created, God says it's not just good, it's tov meod, it's very good. But things have kind of drifted since then, haven't they? We're post-Genesis 3, east of Eden, and there's been a shift. Now, just what kind of shift that is maybe can be illustrated in a joke that I once heard. It's about the garden, when Adam's still by himself. And he comes up to God and says, God, I'd like a wife. And I want her to think I'm the best thing ever, wait on my every need, never be upset, laugh at all my jokes, and tell me that I'm always right. God smiles and looks at him and says, well, Adam, that's going to cost you an arm and a leg. So Adam thinks for a moment, and he says, well, what can I get for just a rib? Not exactly God's original design, but the joke works because it assumes something about marriage that we assume about the other person. What can I get out of this? What can this relationship do for me? The surprising thing is, when we go back to Genesis, that's not God's design at all. In fact, the whole structure of Genesis 2 is put in such a way that it builds anticipation. We see that the man is alone. God goes to work to remedy it. There's this parade of animals that come forth, but none of them are just right for the man. And it starts preparing our heart to join in Adam in celebration when the woman finally gets created. And that's exactly what happens. Because God creates one in the Hebrew. He says, I'm going to make for you an etzer kenegdo. Etzer, one who is a help, who's a support, who's an assistant. But then this next word, kenegdo, it's actually almost a prefix, a verb, and then a suffix. One who is key, who is like you, similar to you. But negdo, who is opposite of you. So I'm going to create one who is like the opposite of the man. And she will be. She's going to be different in all the right ways, in wonderful ways. And yet she's going to be like him, equal in value, dignity, and worth, equal in one who shares in the image and likeness of God. And when Adam finally sees the woman, when God brings her to him, he doesn't ask, hey, what can I get out of this thing? Not at all. He bursts into poetry. Some would even say it's song. In the Hebrew, zot apa'am. This now at last. I always joke when I officiate weddings and I say, my translation? Wow, she's the one. God finally did it. And as we go read on, he says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. It's delight. It's wonder. It's celebration. The first words spoken by a man to a woman are not words of domination, but words of praise. Now that's God's design. And we see even further into that design as we continue reading. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Here they are, fully on display to one another, fully seen, fully known, fully vulnerable, and yet in that, there's safety, there's security, no fear. And that touches at the very heart of God's design for marriage. And really, it sits at the heart of every relationship. My wife and I had the opportunity of both having the same counselor at different times at Covenant Seminary, or the same professor. He's a professor of counseling there. And he has this quote, and my wife will bring it up and we'll talk about it. And what he says is, our greatest desire is to be seen and known. And our greatest fear is to be seen and known. Sit with that for a minute. There's something deeply true about it. We long for someone to know us completely, to know our hopes, our fears, our joys, the wounds that we carry, and our struggles, and still at the same time move towards us in love. But man, are we also terrified by it. What if they see too much? What if they discover something broken, insecure, or shameful? Or what if they decide that I'm not worth loving at all? So instead of moving closer, we hide, we protect ourselves, we keep the parts of ourselves that we don't want anyone to see at a distance. And that's exactly where Genesis 3 takes us. Sin enters the world, and suddenly this man and the woman who are once naked and unashamed, they begin covering themselves, hiding from one another, hiding from God, grasping for control, blaming each other, defending one against each other. And marriage becomes a place where the husband and the wife begin asking, what can I get out of this? Instead of, what can I pour into this relationship? But because marriage touches on some of the deepest desires that we hold, when it flourishes, it can be one of life's greatest blessings. But when it's strained, or when it breaks apart entirely, wow, does it bring profound heartache? Not just emotionally, but spiritually, relationally, even physically, because we're united in spirit, soul, and body, so it touches every aspect of our lives. And because marriage is also the place where children are to be formed, and it's God's best arena for raising them, its effects extend beyond husband and wife. One author describes divorce as creating a quiet storm inside the child that is always brewing underneath the surface. Mom and dad's relationship is one of the primary places where children learn that they're secure, that they're safe, their sense of identity and worth, whether or not people can be trusted, whether or not this world is a safe place to go out and explore and take appropriate risks. And so when that relationship fractures in the home, the child's world can feel fractured as well. And because we live east of Eden, every one of us has been touched by this reality. For some, divorce is a wound that we've carried since childhood. For others, it's the heartache of watching friends, family members, people we love walk through it. Near or far, we have all witnessed the ache that it leaves behind, which means we need to hear Jesus' words carefully today. Not as people standing outside the brokenness of Genesis 3 looking in, but as those who know that brokenness personally. And it isn't to this broken world that Jesus now speaks. But before we get into the text of the Sermon on the Mount on this particular topic, there's two things I want us to carry with us as we go into it. The first one is this. Remember what we said about the sermon and where it lands with what Jesus has already been doing. He's already gone down into the sea, into the waters of chaos. And he's now elevated them. He's bringing them up to the mountain. He's saying, I am now healing you. I'm taking you into the wisdom of heaven. This is not a, hey, if you do these things, then I'll save you. He's saying that salvation has already begun, and I'm now shaping that new redeemed community. In other words, what follows in the sermon are not conditions of salvation. They're the shape of the redeemed life as we inhabit the kingdom. Here's the second piece, and this is important. Jesus doesn't talk about this as a detached observer. Matthew has already been showing us that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. He shares identity and authority with Yahweh, the God of Israel. And that means when Jesus speaks about covenant faithfulness, betrayal, divorce, he's doing it as one who knows that pain personally. Because the story of the Old Testament, in many ways, is a story of God's covenant love for an often unfaithful bride. And again, the prophets describe that unfaithfulness as adultery, which presumes legally to commit adultery, you have to be married. So one more time, I'm going to give you some of these texts. We talked about this a little bit last fall in the Exodus series, but so you can go and research it for yourself. This is not my idea. This is not my opinion. This is what we actually see in the biblical text of God suffering a divorce. He takes his people as his bride at Mount Sinai. We see references back to this in Jeremiah, where he says, I wooed you in the wilderness. I brought you to myself as a bride. So God is married to his people. They're his segulah, his most treasured possession of all that is in his kingdom. But then the kingdom, the people of Israel, they can't get along. They divide. So there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Again, we're now around 586 or 722 BC. The northern kingdom gets sacked, 586, the southern kingdom. But leading up to all of this, God's married to a people. They're divided. What does that mean for his marriage? Well, Ezekiel actually presents him, if you go read Ezekiel 23, as being married now to two sisters. That's his relationship. For the northern kingdom, they have a quicker downward spiral. He divorces them. He's the one that brings the charges. God did nothing wrong. He brings the divorce, but he's not the guilty party. The southern kingdom, he puts them away. He separates from them. Says, I'm putting you away for a period of time until I'm going to bring you back to myself. And one of the beautiful things about the prophets, when we piece it all together, God didn't give up on the northern kingdom either. With the new covenant, when God says, I'm going to come again, I'm going to restore these things, it envisions the sisters being reunited into one bride and God taking his people back as his bride, saying, I will be your God and you'll be my people. That is language straight out of ancient marriage contracts. I'm going to renew this thing. But the point, why do I tell you this? Because God knows what it's like. He has suffered through this. He knows the pain. He knows the heartache. He knows what it's like to be rejected. He knows what it is to love faithfully and not have that love returned. So when Jesus speaks about marriage, he's not speaking coldly or harshly. He's speaking as one who's been in it, who hasn't given up on it, and for a God who desires something better for his people. So we're going to pick up in Matthew 5:27. I'm going to read through it, and then we're going to give some context around what Jesus is saying. So chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard it that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So the first thing, there's a historical context that's happening here. And Jesus is commenting on it. In fact, one scholar says that everybody who heard this, it would have sounded like Jesus was actually commenting on the top headlines of the day. And John the Baptist, he'd already commented on this. He already spoke into it. In fact, he's in jail for it. In Matthew 4, we learn that he's in jail. And why is this? Well, if you go and read Matthew 14, we're told exactly why. He spoke out against Herod Antipas, Herod the great son who was on the throne, and his relationship. And what relationship was that? See, Herod Antipas at the time was married to a woman who was the daughter of a Nabatean king. This is a different territory that is just a little bit off from where Jerusalem is. But while he's married to her, he goes to Rome and he gets the hots for his brother Herod Philip's wife. Her name is Herodias. Now remember where John the Baptist was out preaching in the wilderness, in the desert? It just so happens that that territory was under the rule of Herod Antipas's wife's dad. And John's out there running his mouth about Herod two-timing on his daughter. How do you think the king feels about that? Oh, it's starting to raise tension In fact, there would be a battle that comes later where Herod actually suffers a military defeat at the hands of the Nabateans. Sidebar, we cannot compartmentalize and separate a person's character and their personal life from their public life. We seem to want to do that an awful lot, especially with politicians. It doesn't work. They're the same people in private as they are in public, and it will bleed through, and there'll be social and political ramifications that will go through society. But so what happens is, so Herod is dating his brother Herod Philip's wife. They're both married. And what they do is they both divorce their spouses. Herodias divorces her spouse, Herod Philip, and Herod Antipas divorces his wife, Phaelius. And then they get married. Now let's map this on to what Jesus says. First, don't lust. Because if you're lusting, it's like you've already committed adultery. In fact, it's so serious, you better take extreme measures to keep a check on your interpersonal life. And then he goes on to say, well, you don't think it's a big deal because you think you can give her a certificate of divorce. We'll come back to that. That has to do with Deuteronomy 24 and the kind of divorce that Herod and Herodias would have had to get to legally do this. And he says, nope, you're mistaken on that too. And then he goes on to say these words. Anyone who divorces except for sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So we're going to have to piece apart some of that grammar here. So when you get into Matthew 5:32, and you start looking at the verbs, if we can put that up there, that a woman who herself has divorced. It could be a passive in the Greek, but they also have a tense and voice called the reflexive middle. Best translation, I would say, following a handful of scholars that are versed in this, is that it is a middle reflexive, meaning a wife who herself has divorced. So what Jesus is saying, you got somebody who gets divorced, and he says something similar in Luke, to marry somebody else. She herself has divorced to marry him, and he says that's adultery all the way around. And two notes. First of all, it says the wife who's been divorced, she commits adultery. Well, that doesn't seem fair at all, does it? Doesn't seem a little odd? Wait a minute, she gets divorced, she gets the raw end of the deal, and now she's guilty of adultery? It's not what it's saying. This is not legal code. They're not going to court over this any more than the man who is mad is going to court for murder. But God is concerned with the interior life, the habits of the heart. And so what he is saying is to Herod Antipas, you divorced your wife for no biblical grounds. You didn't have good grounds to divorce her. So you're putting her in a precarious, dangerous situation because she doesn't have a biblically grounded divorce. So when she needs to get remarried because remarriage was presumed, that's like adultery. And guess who's going to carry that punishment for it in God's economy? Not her, Herod. It's a double whammy. Herod, you're committing adultery. You're putting your ex-wife in a situation causing her to commit adultery. And now Herodias, who has divorced her husband, is committing adultery as well. He takes it seriously because he knows, again, the pain and the heartache that this causes. And by doing this, he's leveling a charge against Herod. We've already seen this tension in Matthew of two kings, King Herod and King Jesus. Who's the true king of the Jews? Jesus is saying implicitly, it ain't that guy. That is not the righteous king that Israel has been longing for and who's going to be the hope of the world. Look to Jesus. So that's part of what he's doing. At the same time, this is a kill two birds with one stone. There was a raging debate of the day over divorce. What constituted a divorce that was biblically grounded, and how does that all work? And so what we have to know historically, leading up to the time of Jesus, there's two rabbinical houses, two rabbinical schools. The school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. These were the two authorities of that time. And they disagreed about divorce and what were the biblical grounds for it. And the whole debate goes back to Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. And the debate is, what are the grounds for divorce in that passage? And Jesus has already mentioned our certificate of divorce. We know this is in the context. We know this is in his thinking, but there's even more to it. So I want to take us back really quick to Deuteronomy 24, those first four verses. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Now, apart from being just a massive mouthful, run-on sentence, and it's the same way in the Hebrew, you look at that and you're like, wait a minute, so if somebody gets divorced, they can't remarry their former spouse? Not exactly. This is addressing a very particular situation that could have transpired and often transpired in the ancient Near East based on the financial transactions that were associated with marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Here's the scenario that Deuteronomy 24 is spelling out. Man and a woman are married. He divorces her because he finds a matter of indecency, meaning he claims that he had biblically grounded cause to seek the divorce. In that case, he wouldn't have to pay when she leaves and he sends her out. So that's whether or not those were there, doesn't matter. He says, oh, I'm sending her out. She marries, now two more scenarios now come after that. She now either, one, marries somebody else who either, one, divorces her because he hates her. That's the language, he hates her. So that language is technical language. We can go back again to ancient Near Eastern divorce documents. The man who hates and divorces. It was a divorce that was basically what it sounds like. I don't really like her anymore. You know, the original stuff kind of wore off a little bit. So it's a divorce that is not based on valid biblical grounds. In that case, if that man divorces based on hate, he's got to pay up. She's walking away with money, and the other guy knows it. On the other hand, if she gets remarried, and that guy dies, she's also getting assets. So now, one of those two things happen. I know it's a lot to follow. Either she gets divorced and gets a payout, or he dies and she gets a payout. Man number one says, wow, she's got some money. And in the ancient Near East, you could go out and reclaim your former wife, her assets, any of the children, and the fruits of their labor. So to demand to be given a certificate of divorce, this is unheard of in the ancient Near East. What that signals is, because we know from some of the language from some of the ancient ones, is she can now remarry, and the former husband number one has no claim over her legally. All she's got to do is show that certificate and say, nope, not going to happen. But what this prevents is from the man is saying, well, maybe she's not that unclean. Because if he would have said, I'm divorcing you on valid grounds, according to the Torah, she would be unclean. And so now, the writer comes through, Moses, and says, hey, you said she's unclean, and now what? Because she's got money, you're kind of reneging on that? Well, maybe it's not so bad. I think I'll take her back and get some of the, what that comes with it. He says, no, that's actually an abomination to the Lord. And that word abomination, you're like, wow, that seems like some pretty harsh language for just a financial transaction. Exactly, because that's the same language that gets used in the proverb for somebody who's giving mismatched scales and taking economic advantage of others and saying that is an abomination to the Lord. The Lord hates it. He hates unjust financial transactions. And that's what this is preventing in Deuteronomy 24:1. It's preventing a woman from getting taken advantage of in that ancient Near Eastern culture. Now, hang with me. The debate is over verse 1 and the language there. So let's look at that. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. This was the whole rage of the argument in the first century. So it's this, what is this some indecency? It's two different words in the Hebrew, arat, davar. Arat and indecency. Mostly probably some sort of sexual infidelity. And then, you can stay on that slide for a second. And then davar, a matter or a thing. So this is a very strange grammatical construction in the Hebrew. And as the rabbis and the Jews love to do, they paid attention to every detail in the text. So they go into that, the school of Shammai, and says, oh, there's a weird construction there for a reason. God's telling us something. He's showing us something. He's saying there's two grounds of divorce. I'm sorry, this is the school of Hillel. school of Hillel saying there's two grounds for divorce here. Either arat, an indecency, she did something, or a davar, a matter or thing, as in anything. Sounds pretty good for the men in charge, doesn't it? Not bad. Shammai says, nope, you can't do it. So now you can go to that next one. Thank you, Stephen. Shammai says, nope, it's an indecency of thing, and what they would say is it's a matter of indecency. It actually has to have just valid ground. She actually has to have done something that shows infidelity and unfaithful in the covenant to actually have a valid ground for divorce. So this is the whole debate. Does Deuteronomy 24 say, yep, matter of indecency? Or is it indecency plus anything else at all? And we can see this in some of the writings. I'll give you one. It's from the Sifra Deuteronomy. The school of Shammai says, a man should not divorce his wife except if he found indecency in her, since it says he found in her an indecent matter. And the school of Hillel said, if she spoiled the dish, since it says a matter, meaning she spoiled the food, they don't like her anymore, that's any matter, and that qualifies for a divorce. And you can see how this actually translates into abuse and women getting taken advantage of you. So what does Jesus say in Matthew 5:32? But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on a thing or matter of porneia, of indecency. Which school is he siding with? Shammai. He's saying, no, it's only a matter of indecency. It's not any matter. He's saying the school of Hillel is wrong, and I know the Pharisees have been using this, and you know what? King Herod used it, and it's invalid. By the way, this is the type of divorce that Joseph was probably seeking because it was the least shameful. You didn't have to go very public with things. You could have put her away quietly. But this is what Herod used, and Jesus is saying, nope, that's not valid. And the same thing comes up again when the Pharisees confront him in Matthew 19. And they come and they test him and they say, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause at all? And Jesus responds in verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for, he uses the one word, porneia, indecency, and marries another, commits adultery. He's weighing in on the bait. Nope, you're right, you heard me right. I'm going with the school of Shammai, not Hillel. That's where Jesus falls on the debate. So a question then is like, well, is that it? What if you suffered a divorce, but it wasn't adultery? Are there biblical grounds for that? Jesus doesn't really comment on it. But what the schools of Shammai and the school of Hillel all agreed is if you go back to Exodus 21, verses 10 through 11, that these gave the basic ground framework for what is expected of a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage. Now, Jesus doesn't comment on it, but Paul echoes it in Ephesians 5 and 1 Corinthians 7. And so I want to look at this passage really quick in Exodus 21. It's in a less than ideal situation. It's where God meeting his people where they are after he rescues them out of Egypt. And it's in the case where a family gets in trouble. They have to sell maybe their kids into slavery, and a woman becomes a maidservant, and she becomes part of the other family, and she's married into it. In the situation where another wife is taken, again, not God's ideal, but in that situation, here's what the law says. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, clothing, or marital rights. Now that last word, all sorts of suggestions, almost as many as there are commentaries of what it means. It's one word that appears only here in the entire Hebrew text. Some will say it's ointments, cosmetics, all different things, but the most ancient translations, for example, the Targums, will translate this as marital or conjugal rights. Everything, all the intimacy parts of marriage. She's owed that. And if he doesn't keep that up, she gets to go free. So it's moving this woman in this position to a position of freedom if these things aren't kept. So food, clothing, marital, conjugal rights. Paul now in Ephesians 5, He says, he who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it just as Christ does the church. That word for nourishes by feeding. The word for cherishes, to care for by keeping warm, to clothe. We've got love, clothing, and food. Paul is echoing and saying, this is baseline what's expected. And if there's back in the rabbinical law, if there was a habitual, continually gross neglect of these things with an unrepented party, then these were considered biblical grounds for divorce. It wasn't taken lightly, especially in the school of Shammai. They debate what this is. They'd often send couples back and say, okay, you see these things, let's give you another chance. They would change the payments of, hey, if you get divorced right now, and they thought one couple was violating things more than the other, or one party, they'd say, okay, well, your payment's not going to be very good right now, yours is. You want to think about it some more? Yeah, we might want to work that out. All right, we'll come back to us. So you encourage them to work this out. But these things are the biblical grounds for divorce in the Bible, and they get actually narrowed into two different things. The food and the clothing was material support, and then the conjugal rights, the love, is emotional support, which gets really interesting because when you look at the Septuagint, it says clothing, and then this other word, homologeo, conversation, companionship. These are the parts of the covenant that both are responsible for. And one other thing while we're on it, because I just want to clear up some text, because I've seen some of these get used to beat people up in ways that they probably shouldn't be used. So when Paul says, he who loves doesn't hate his own flesh, he's quoting back to Genesis, the two shall become one flesh, but also Malachi 2:16. Now, Malachi 2:16 is dealing with the Hebrew men who were leaving the wives of their youth, who are now more aged, and finding younger pagan women. And God comes in to the prophet and speaks to it and says, the man who hates and divorces covers his own garment with violence. Now, I bring this one up because the translations aren't always the same. If you look at the NIV, check out between 2011 when they updated and before then. It used to say God hates divorce. DSV says the man who doesn't love. Literally, in the Hebrew text, the Masoretic and the Greek translation is the man who hates and divorces, meaning if you're just divorcing because you're being flippant towards your wife and you want the younger version, nope, not valid grounds. And it actually brings violence upon your own garments, upon your own flesh, because the two are one. But sometimes what we can hear with that Malachi 2:16 passage is God hates divorcees. No. I think we can say God hates divorce. We can see how stringent Jesus is towards it. It ruins his good creation. It's not his good design. But Malachi 2:16 is the man who hates and divorces, brings violence. And that word violence, Hamas, we've talked about that word. It's back in Genesis. It shows up in Genesis 6, during the flood. The world is filled with Hamas. And why is the world filled with Hamas? Because of the heart. The human heart is continually evil. What does God say about divorce? Why does Moses, and by the way, pay attention to his language. He doesn't command the divorce certificate. He says he permits it. Divorce isn't compulsory. He says it's a choice, but he says he permits it. And what does he say in Matthew 19? He said, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce. The word for hardness of heart, sclerocardian, only occurs 2 places in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 10:16 and Jeremiah 4:4, and both of them have to do with circumcising the heart, getting rid of your stubborn heart and being receptive to God's truth and God's guidance. And this is the good news of the entire Old Testament. This is what God wants to do something about, this hard-heartedness. He wants soft hearts. He wants changed hearts. Even in Jeremiah 31, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. He's going to give us hearts that actually follow his guidance and his will for our lives. Even more explicit, Ezekiel 36, verses 26 to 27. And I will give you a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules. There's imagery here. The human heart, there's two. There's one, the heart of flesh, or there's the heart of stone. And what's the difference? What's the stone going to do when the Spirit's poured out? Bouncing right off. What about the soft heart that's fleshly, that's pliable, that's receptive? It absorbs it. It takes God's Spirit in. Jesus is saying when there's a divorce, when there's a breakdown in this marriage, there's hard-heartedness involved, at least for one of the parties. Because if we're forgiving one another, as Christ forgave us, if we're showing compassion and kindness, these words that Paul uses in Colossians, it shouldn't happen that way for the people who are redeemed, the people who have soft hearts, those who are having the Spirit of God fill them. And Jesus certainly doesn't give up on God's good design for marriage. He goes back and he quotes, again from Genesis 2. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. So a couple of practicals as we now round the corner for home. What do we do? Repentance. Our kids talked about this week in VBS. Turning back towards God. The promise, when we turn towards him, he's going to take that hard heart, he's going to soften it, he's going to make it receptive to his word, open to it, for his Spirit to pull in so we can do these relationships different from the world. And we have to turn to him. Why? Because we can't do it on our own. When Paul writes these words in Ephesians 5 about what a marriage relationship is to look like, the doesn't start in Ephesians 5. It's a big, long, run-on sentence. It starts back in 5:18. The controlling verb and narrative for everything that Paul writes about in Ephesians 5 for marriage starts with the controlling finite imperative. Be filled with the Spirit. And then he just goes on with these subordinate participles. Singing hymns to one another, speaking to one another in this way, submitting to one another. Wives to your husbands this way. Men, another imperative, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, why do we need the Spirit for that? How did he love the church? He gave himself for her. Put her above his own needs. Used what he uniquely had to elevate her, to make his bride beautiful, to put her on display to the world. That's the high calling of men. If we think we can do that on our own, we're in a bad spot. We need the filling of the Spirit to give us soft hearts and wisdom and guidance on what that looks like to such a degree that when a woman reads that first part of Ephesians 5 of submit to your husbands, there's no knee-jerk reaction, and it's just as delightful as submitting to the Lord. That is a tall order. It's a different kind of community, but it's a community that only happens with the Spirit of God. And then men, especially, we've got to speak into things. Speak into the chaos. Speak into the confusion of things. For a while, I dabbled in some HVAC work, and I loved it. You know what I loved about it? Sorry, this is my mock air conditioner. I know it's nothing like it, but just to give you a visual. When you do HVAC work, you've got variables. You got something called superheat, you've got subcooling. All you got to do is make a little tweak in the input and you get your output. It's fantastic. You go to diagnose a system, there's a whole flow chart. Well, you start with your voltage, okay, not the voltage, is it the contactor, not the contactor? Okay, let's check the capacitor. And you go down the line and you can fix it. And you know what else these sort of things come with? Oh, a manual. Tells you everything. You got this problem, here's what you do. I love it. It's easy. I can fix that. You know what didn't come with a manual? My beautiful wife. And she is more complex than an air conditioner. But they don't teach you this stuff in school. It's why we need the wisdom of God. How do we do this well? How do we love? How do we speak into things? Because otherwise we recapitulate the sin of Adam. When the serpent's there deceiving, what's Adam doing? Nothing. He's silent. He's right there with her. And we actually reenact this silence of Adam and the sin of our original father. on earth. We've got to speak into things. It's like, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to go into that. Well, that's for a prayer in the Spirit. You've got to move into it. You've got to move towards one another. That's the high responsibility and calling of men. And then for men and women, I use this passage in Colossians 3, again at weddings. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, meekness, patience, bearing with one another. When one of you has something against the other, forgiving one another as Christ forgave you. And above all, put on love, which binds together in perfect harmony. What if we all started there? What would that do as those who are empowered by the Spirit? There's a beautiful story of one of these cases that's preserved for us in the Hebrew Midrash, some of the teachings and expansions on the Scripture, and it's about a couple who was childless. And so under the Torah, bearing children, being fruitful and multiplying was one of the 613 commands of Torah. So if you couldn't have children, especially by the time of 18, because they were getting married much younger then you were allowed to divorce or go try with somebody else so you can have this blessing of children. So there was a couple that come to the rabbinical court, the council, and they say, well, we can't have children, so we think we're going to divorce. Only the rabbi that was proceeding, he picked up on something. He noticed that there was still an underlying love with this couple. And he says, I tell you what, here's what you do. I'll grant it, but here's what I want you to do first. I want you to go home and I want you to celebrate. I want you to call your friends and family together and have a festival because I want you to exit this with the same joy as when you first entered it. And so they say, okay, well, we can do that. We'll have a party and get the wine going and everything else. And so they go, invite all their friends over, and the husband says to his wife, he goes, we've had such a good run and everything else. I wanted to do something for you. Before you go back to your parents' house the next day, I want you to pick anything in our house that's most precious to you, that's most treasured, and I want you to take it back to your father and mother's house. So the party ensues, and the man, fruit of the vine makes the heart go merry, and his heart was merry, and he's finally asleep, and he's out. And so then the woman, she gets her friends together, has the bed with the man on it carried to her parents' house. Oh, the surprise when he wakes up in the morning. And what she says to him was this: of all that we have, you are my most treasured possession. You're what I want. They go back to the rabbi. The rabbi blesses them, and they have children. The point, God is pro-marriage. He's going to honor our work and our efforts. He's going to fill in the gaps and move in with his Spirit if we would surrender to him, if we would submit, if we would repent, turn towards him for soft hearts. But what about when it doesn't end up like that? What's the hope now? You're on the tail end of this thing, and you're alone. This is again where God moves in. God is a groom. Very beautiful book, the Song of Songs. I don't call it the Song of Solomon because I don't think Solomon wrote it. Not exactly the ideal lover. It's actually the story of a young shepherd and a young shepherdess. Now, they idealize each other in terms of Solomon. Says, man, I like this guy so much. He's like a Solomon to me. That's why that Solomon comes into there. But it's not just about the young love of a shepherd and a shepherdess. It's also the love of God and his people. God moves in as a bride. This theme gets picked up through John, carried all the way through Revelation. But particularly one story in John 4, the story of the woman at the well. Here we have a man, he's traveling, he's at a well, he's meeting a woman. The alarm bells are going off if you're reading this and you know the Old Testament. Man and woman at a well, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel, Moses and Zipporah. This is where weddings are arranged. This is where people meet. First century Jewish audiences would have picked up on this. And right before John 4 and John 3, what does John call Jesus? The bridegroom. And Jesus tells the woman everything that she had ever done. He sees her, knows every last detail. And he says, yeah, I know all the men, and the one you're with now is not your husband. And he offers her living water. So here Jesus is, meets this woman whose life is marked by relational disappointment and brokenness. But he doesn't come merely to fix her marriage situation. He comes as the true bridegroom, the one every marriage ultimately points to, the one who knows her completely and yet moves towards her. He's the one that can satisfy a thirst that no human spouse can satisfy. So for those of us in marriage, if we're pouring out into the other, as Paul says in Philippians 2, 5-11, have this thinking as Christ had. Pour yourselves out, taking what you had to build the other up. We've got to be poured in. We've got to be filled up with his Spirit. For those who are single, there's something greater on offer, and Jesus picks up on it. He says there's eunuchs, those who are celibate. Some chose that way. Some are made that way by man. Or some are born that way. Some are made by man. And then some choose it for the kingdom of God. It says, he who has ears, let him hear. There's a deeper, more intimate relationship available. Like what Jesus was offering the woman at the well. He sees and knows everything about her. Instead of running away, he meets her greatest desire. The desire we first talked about. To be seen and to be known. That's what's on offer. No matter where you are in this journey, young people, that starts now. Because if you don't have him as your primary spouse, you're not going to pour into your spouse. And what you want is to find somebody, when you're running so fast and hard against God, you want to look over and see somebody running that same direction. Because there's a kingdom purpose to marriage. And it points to the greater reality of the bridegroom who is taking his people, restoring all things, giving us new hearts. This is the hope of marriage. And if we live this way, this is a different kind of community. And this becomes a different kind of community that becomes a city on the hill. The salt of the world. Starts adding beauty and witness to the God who has not given up on his good creation. May it be so. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Turn his face towards you, giving you his peace, making you whole as the one who can completely fill and satisfy your greatest desires and the broken places of our lives. Amen.